Good evening, everyone. I would like to very warmly welcome you during this evening, during our special event on campus. How many of you remember beginning of pandemic? Everybody. I remember quite well. And I especially remember the press briefings with members of coronavirus task force. Right? Anthony Fauci, Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx, who advocated to shut down our entire country and lock down our schools, including universities. I was against it. My friend can confirm. I was really against it, but I'm not an expert in pandemics. Right? So at the same time, I was watching some programs on TV, and one person really brought my attention. It was senior fellow from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, Dr. Scott Atlas, our today's speaker. He actually said that we should not lock down our schools, we should not shut down our country, we should protect our elderly and vulnerable population. So, and I remember like today, I was talking to my wife and I said, oh boy, if a president right now or vice president could watch this gentleman on TV, maybe they could invite him, right, to White House. You know, it took them a little bit time to figure it out, but they finally invited him. The president invited him and he served as a special advisor to president on pandemics and special advisor to task force. Right? So I actually could talk very long time to actually details all the accomplishments and achievements of our speaker. And I could present a long list of the positions he held in the past and organizations he either founded or worked with. But I will not do this because I know that most of you know all of this more than I do, and you probably know more than we advertise in our advertising material. But there is one thing you don't know for sure. There is one fact you are not aware, and this fact was not reported by media, was not reported by news. Do you know what fact I'm talking about? No, you have no idea. Dr. Scott Atlas married his wife 40 years ago on the same day I married my wife. So we share 40th anniversary this summer on the same day. But anyway, I will not spend more time because we want to listen to Scott Atlas of me. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Atlas from Hoover Institution at Stanford University, institution who is now for the public policy think tank promoting and defending free enterprise, small government, and personal economic liberty.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Professor Jowett, for that introduction. No one's ever introduced me with my wedding anniversary, so that's the best introduction I can have. Okay, well, pleasure to be in the Midwest. I'm a Midwesterner, and I miss it. I've been in California for 22 years, so you can imagine. Midwest is where I met my wife. Midwest is where I consider people to be normal. And that word I use very sparingly these days. So, today I'm going to go through a lot of slides, a lot of data, very little opinion, yet people will somehow disagree, I'm sure. But I always say to the students, you know, the way you form an opinion, particularly about policy, is you get the information, think critically, and only then form your opinion, not the other way around. It doesn't work that way. And so, given that I'm on a campus, I happen to think that the most important thing I do when I speak is to speak to students, young people, because as opposed to people, everyone has striding opinions these days, but somehow young people at least listen to facts and are at least considering changing their mind because of the facts. So I'm going to present to you the facts. And at the end, I will answer as many questions as you guys have. I entitled this Science, Academia, and Public Health Will Trust Return because this is what we're left with after this fiasco that we've endured the last 2 years. It's not about the pandemic at this point. It's about institutional trust. It's about a loss of credibility. And these are institutions that we need to have trust in. We need to function as a society. We're a very heterogeneous society. No one can know everything about everything, and we need to have people who we can rely on. And this trust has been damaged. In fact, I believe America's in serious crisis. Government and what I call the credentialed class, that these are essential institutions, public health agencies, universities, doctors, scientists, schools, media, have been exposed by the pandemic. And they've been exposed in 2 ways. They've been exposed as non-experts, and they've been exposed as heavily politicized. Unprecedented denial of fact is rampant today in science and in public health. It's not simply a loss of freedom of speech. It's literally the denial of fact. As a society, the pandemic showed me something, the most heartbreaking thing of all. We broke the social contract we have with our children as adults. We harmed them directly, and we failed as role models. And the free exchange of ideas that, of course, is essential to finding the truths that we need is now under threat in the United States. And I'm going to go through all these. This is what was claimed. This is the history. In the spring of 2020, SARS-CoV coronavirus was claimed to have a far higher fatality rate than influenza by several orders of magnitude. That everyone had a significant risk to die, that no one had immunity because the virus was new. That everyone was dangerous and equally spreads the infection. That asymptomatic people are major drivers of the spread. That locking down will stop or eliminate the virus. That masks will protect everyone and stop the spread, and that immune protection can only be from a vaccine. All of these things are false. All of these things were false and were known to be false by spring of 2020. Huxley said facts do not cease to exist because they are known. The history is the following. The U.S. enacted what I call the Birx-Fauci lockdowns. It started, as everyone remembers, with something called 15 days to slow the spread. And this was entirely rational because the idea was to slow the spread of the infection so that the hospitals could function and not be overwhelmed. That is, they could function to treat people with COVID, but also to treat other people. The leaders of the federal policy were Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci. That's why they're called the Birx-Fauci lockdowns, because Deborah Birx was the official White House task force coordinator, the head of the medical side of the task force. She wrote all of the official federal guidelines to every state. She visited dozens of states, sometimes with the vice president, from the end of February throughout the entire year and until there was a new president in January 2021. I got to Washington, by the way, on July 31st, 2020, 6 months after the Fauci-Birx head of the federal policy. And I was there for 3.5 months. Anthony Fauci is also named here because he wasn't in charge of anything this despite what the perception was, but he was the most influential person to the public. He was the most visible face of the task force on TV and in the media, and then under President Biden, he was officially named Chief Medical Advisor. The policy guidance of Birx and Fauci was first, like I said, flatten the curve, and that quickly became something else. Stop all cases of COVID, period. And that was done in their guidance by lockdowns. And lockdowns means school closures, business shutdowns, limits on medical care, and a host of restrictions, mandates, and quarantines. The policy result is what must be judged. The policy result is identical under two administrations. It is not political. Almost all states implemented the Birx-Fauci guidance. Almost every state. And what happened? Well, first, the guidance failed. The lockdowns were implemented and more than 1 million American deaths have been attributed to the COVID illness, the virus. And secondly, the lockdowns themselves caused massive death and destruction, severely harming millions of families and children, but particularly the working class and the poor. I'm going to get back to that. Why do I say the lockdowns had the same result in both administrations? Well, this is the curve of confirmed COVID deaths per million since the beginning of the pandemic, with the intervening line there being the change of administration. That's the United States compared to our peer nations. This is the United States highlighted with the peer nations subtly up. There's a straight line there. Okay, that's the slope of the line. It's constant. Under two administrations, with or without the vaccine. The lockdowners own the outcomes. Their policies were implemented. There was this overwhelming attempt to rewrite history by the people who advised the lockdowns, to blame people who criticized the lockdowns for the failure of the lockdowns. The safer alternative was known by March of 2020, and that was called targeted protection. And 3 of us wrote that in the public literature, the newspapers. That's the public literature. Johnny Anides of Stanford, David Katz, and I all independently wrote something calling for, instead of broad lockdowns, we knew who was at risk. We should do everything we can to increase the protection of the high-risk group, but not destroy people by locking down low-risk people. Martin Kulldorff, an epidemiologist from Harvard, tried to get something. He couldn't get anything published in the United States. He had to write something in CNN Espanol on targeted protection. Later in the spring and in the summer and then in the fall of 2020, many other people called for targeted protection. 6 or 7 months later, something called the Great Barrington Declaration was written by Kulldorff, Sunetra Gupta from Oxford, and Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford. And they called for targeted protection. That meant increasing protection of the high-risk people and not destroying everybody else. It's very important to understand lockdowns were never recommended before this pandemic. The standard lockdown literature, the standard pandemic literature was written, this is the key paper from 2006, almost 15 years before the pandemic. Henderson is the man credited with ending smallpox. This was a standard paper that called for the following. All who are ill remain isolated at home or in the hospital, but others continue to come to work so essential services can be sustained. Closing schools for any longer than 10 or 14 days at the very beginning of an epidemic in the hopes of mitigating the epidemic is not warranted. Canceling or postponing large meetings would not be likely to have any significant effect on the development of the pandemic. There is no basis for recommending quarantine either of groups or individuals. Screening passengers at borders or closing air or rail cars. Experience has shown that these actions are not effective and could have serious adverse consequences that they are not recommended. That is the standard of pandemic management. And their final point was an overriding principle that experience has shown communities faced with epidemics or other adverse events respond best and with the least anxiety when the normal social function of the community is least disrupted. That's not what was done, of course. Now, remember, the data that we have is known to be flawed. Why do I say that? Well, I'm going to go through a little bit about this with PCR testing, timelines and trends based on PCR testing, and hospitalization and death, quote, from COVID-19. PCR testing, which is the way that this was diagnosed, and therefore, if you were positive, you were quarantined or isolated, and everyone who came into contact with you was quarantined and tested multiple times. PCR testing was done with a certain technique, and that's called the cycle threshold. Okay? It's a technique that the more you average, or the higher the cycle threshold, the more sensitive you are to finding pieces of the virus. Okay? That's really all you have to know, and the fact is the machine stops when it detects the virus. So if there's a high cycle threshold, that means there's a minuscule amount of material to detect. It turns out that at a cycle threshold of 35, 97% of positives were dead virus. You were not contagious. 97% of positive PCR tests. Okay, that's a fact. That's not my opinion. This is the data. Why is that relevant? Because every country in the world, most countries, use a higher cycle threshold than 35, including the UK, the United States, Israel, etc. It turned out, I presented this to the task force back in August, September, October. No one cared. No one acknowledged it. I handed the papers to the people in the task force at the table. There was never an acknowledgement. And then they later dug up. Because remember, I didn't get to the White House until July 31st. Turned out, someone said in July 2020, at a cycle threshold of 35 or more, the chances of it being contagious are minuscule. You got to say it's just dead nucleotides. And that person was Anthony Fauci. He said that long before I got there. It was never acknowledged to the public or otherwise. What about hospitalizations from COVID-19? This is a paper published by the Stanford University Pediatric Hospital. About half the patients hospitalized for COVID-19 on chart review had zero symptoms of COVID-19. They did not have COVID-19. They were called COVID-19 hospitalizations. Why? Because they had a positive test for the virus. They were hospitalized for something else. Every patient who was hospitalized at that time had testing done for SARS-2. Okay, so a kid comes in with appendicitis, positive virus test, he's categorized as COVID. Hospitalization. Okay, same thing if you had a fractured skull, broken leg. You have a SARS-2 positive virus, that's what's called COVID hospitalization. Half of the kids hospitalized in that study had no symptoms of COVID, but they went down as a COVID hospitalization. We're talking about how dangerous the illness is for children. This is a larger study. 86% of hospitalizations in the pediatric hospital system in California had no symptoms of COVID, but they were called COVID. What about deaths from COVID? This is the CDC's data. This is not my opinion, by the way. They studied retrospectively charts of people called and death certificates called deaths from COVID. In people under 18, 35.2%, quote, could not be plausibly categorized as COVID-19, but they were called COVID-19 deaths. What is the risk? Well, the original World Health Organization estimate was that it was a very high infection fatality rate of 3.4%. After multiple studies were done that I list there, the actual infection fatality rate in people under 70 is 0.05. That's roughly on the order of influenza for people under 70. Age is the most important risk for COVID death. The mean age in the United States and all over the world for death from COVID is about 80. If you look at that table on the right, it shows that the risk of death is thousands-fold higher for old people compared to young people. This is amazing, and it's a blessing. And the public was this was never emphasized to the public by the public health agency. For perspective, the median age of death from COVID was equal to or older than the life expectancy in those countries. That's not minimizing the death from COVID. People died from COVID. There's no question about that. For some people, it's very dangerous. This is just clinical perspective that was never given to the public. In the United States, 2/3 of deaths were not just in old people. They were in people with greater than or equal to 6 comorbidities, 6 underlying illnesses. If you're a 75-year-old person and you have controlled high blood pressure, you don't have a higher risk of COVID death. That was a misinformation, to use a very popular term. What about healthy children? The risk to healthy children is extremely low, minuscule, to die from COVID. That's a fact. That's not my opinion. This is the data from California. While there were many cases on the left, 14% of cases were in kids and children. 0% of deaths were in children. Not 0 deaths, but it rounds to 0%. This is Florida. 0% case fatality rate in kids under 16, and in fact, in people under 30, 0%. Case fatality rate, by the way, is of the people who were sick enough with COVID to go see a doctor, how many died. Not of everybody who's infected. It's much lower. The risk from children is low. That's a fact. That was known since spring of 2020. That's not new knowledge. That's not learned. That was known from dozens of studies all over the world, including Norway, Sweden, Spain, the Netherlands, Ireland, Iceland, Switzerland, France, Australia, Germany, Greece, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. Not only that, open schools in spring of 2020 were known to not be associated with increased community transmission, and that K-12 teachers have the same case incidence as the community. Anyone who says that a K-12 teacher has a higher risk is lying or doesn't know the data. Those are the only 2 possibilities, because it's simply not true. The case for opening schools was the first thing I did when I went to Washington. I said, okay, what's the low-hanging fruit? What can I do here? Because I know I'm not going to change anybody's mind. And so I said, okay, let's say, what's the obvious? Open the schools. Because healthy children do not have a significantly high risk for a serious consequence from COVID. Harms of closing in-person schools were enormous. And nothing, in my view, is more important to any civilized society than educating our children. Not only that, but by late spring of 2020, from the spring closures alone, it was proven that there were massive problems with online learning. Math and reading losses were enormous, massive increase in failing grades. A Stanford Education Institute study started their conclusions by saying the findings on learning losses are chilling. Of course, everyone here who has a kid, or even those who don't, understand that people learn in school a lot more than simply what the books say: socialization, conflict resolution, physical activity. Poor kids, they often get their best nutrition from school. We learn if a child has a hearing loss or vision loss from going to school. And all of these losses are far greater for minorities and the poor. For a society that cares about that, or purports to care about low-income families, what happened here? In In my neighborhood, in Palo Alto, California, where everybody's got a PhD, it's easy to get a little micro school going with their names. That's not what most people know. America closed schools. Why do I say it that way? Because we were one of the only schools, one of the only countries of our peer nations to close schools in this fall term of 2020. Almost the entire Western Europe and elsewhere opened schools. They knew the data. We closed schools. What happened? Well, this is a graph that shows medical insurance claims. This is not a survey of how you felt. This is just data. And the zero line represents no change compared to the previous year, 2019. And what we see here is that in teenagers, medical visits to doctors went way down. And why is that? Because the hospitals and clinics were closed to non-COVID for the most part, or people were so afraid they didn't go in. They didn't want to be in an environment, in a medical environment. And that's objectively what we saw happen. It was all predicted and predictable and obvious. What happened to mental health claims in teenagers? They skyrocketed. This is compared to the previous year, month to month during the lockdown in 2020. This is self-harm visits in teenagers. The blue is 2019. They doubled and tripled during the lockdown in teenagers. You know what self-harm is? Putting cigarettes out in your mouth, slashing your wrist. In teenagers, skyrocketed during the lockdown. Psychiatric illness, anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, skyrocketed in college-age students during the lockdown. Drug abuse, substance abuse disorders, skyrocketed during the lockdown. This is not from the virus. None of this is from the virus. This is from the isolation, from the lockdowns, from the adult decisions that were made. There's a long list of things that happened. I'm just going to say a few of them here. During the spring closures alone of schools, 300,000 cases of child abuse in the United States went unreported in the spring 2020 school closure. Because the schools are the #1 agency where child abuse is reported. 3/4 of college-age students reported at least one mental health system by the June 2020 report, and 1 in 4 contemplated suicide by June of 2020. College-age students in the United States from the lockdowns. Mandela said there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children, and the United States failed egregiously. It's a disgrace. Lockdowns must be defined before I go further. And why do I have this slide up? Because at one of the big meetings in the White House, it was obvious. I was the only one saying, listen, the implementation of the policy is destroying people. No one cared. Not once did anyone say it about me. And finally, it became obvious that lockdowns, I was making a good case internally, and the data was piling up. And so one time, across from me, Dr. Burks said, Scott, no one on the task force wants a lockdown. This is in October, after 6 months of lockdown. And I said, oh, really? I said, are you for closing schools? Yes. Are you for shutting down or restricting hours of businesses? Yes. Are you for limiting medical care for non-COVID patients? Yes. Are you for limiting family interactions? Yes. Are you for shutting off travel? Yes. Are you for quarantining low-risk asymptomatic people? Yes. I said, then you're for lockdowns. The lockdowns failed. This is the fact. This is not an opinion. No matter what Governor Newsom says, no matter what Governor Whitman says, no matter what Governor Cuomo says. This is a study, Bjornstad, March 2021, comparing mortality in 24 European countries. More severe lockdown policies have not been associated with lower mortality. In other words, the lockdowns have not worked as intended, unquote. This is a Stanford study, January 2021. We do not find significant benefits on case growth. The first paper was deaths. Didn't work for that. This is a paper on cases. Did not work for that. And Johnny Anides, one of the co-authors, was quoted as saying the lockdowns were, quote, usually harmful and pro-contagion. Why is that? Because the cases spread indoors. I don't know if you guys remember, you probably do, that police were arresting people on beaches and in parks and telling you to be confined in your homes. This is a study from USC and Rand Institute, June 2021. I'm showing you the quotes from the papers here. This is not opinion. I just want to remind people that. They looked at 43 countries in the United States, and this is their data. With longer shelter-in-place orders in place, the excess deaths increased. Excess deaths means deaths over and above a year without the pandemic. With earlier lockdowns, faster lockdowns, increased excess deaths. And in the 43 countries and 50 states, excess deaths were falling. But when the lockdowns were put into place, the death toll began increasing. This is their graph, in case you don't believe that. The vertical line is the timing of putting in the lockdown policy. And you see that prior to the implementation of shelter-in-place policies, excess deaths were decreasing in most countries and states. However, following the implementation of shelter-in-place policies, lockdowns, excess mortality increases, a trend that continued through the length of the shelter-in-place policy. This is a study from Johns Hopkins, January 2022. They looked at all the literature in the world, and their quotes were, lockdowns have had little to no public health effects, meaning saving lives, but they impose enormous economic and social costs. Quote, lockdown policies are ill-founded and should be rejected as a pandemic policy instrument. This only reiterated what we knew. Remember I showed that 2006 paper. That was known. Yet for some reason, inexplicably, lockdowns were implemented. This is a study, April 2022, from University of Chicago economists and elders, who looked at all the states and determined their success at pandemic management using three criteria: mortality, economic disruption, and educational disruption. Quantitatively, these are the states that did the best, and you'll notice two of the states that are most criticized for opening were in the top 6. The states with the severest lockdown policies did the worst: Illinois, California, New Mexico, New York, Washington, D.C., and New Jersey. If you're interested, Michigan ranked 40th out of 50. Feynman said, it does not matter who you are, or how smart you are, or what title you have, or how many of you there are, and certainly not how many papers your side has published. If your prediction is wrong, then your hypothesis is wrong, period. If you don't know who Richard Feynman is, go look it up. I mentioned this, but I want to reiterate this. Lockdowns destroyed low-income families while sparing the affluent. This is change in employment by wage quartile of the job. And you'll notice that the lowest wage quartile had the most profound drop in employment during the lockdown and the most protracted drop in employment. This is the effect of COVID on educational progress by an income group. The lowest income families had the worst impact from educational losses from the lockdown. This is the persistence of job loss by wage of the job. And the lower income jobs had the most profound loss and the most persistent even to this day. The people that say that they care about poor people, low-income people, and children were the ones who implemented the lockdowns. They can't get away with that. They can't get away with rewriting history. I always say the lockdowns are a luxury of the rich, because people like me, who live in Palo Alto and work from home, travel around, get their salary, my wife has a PhD, she can educate our kids, we weren't impacted by the lockdown like these people. This is very important here. The lockdowns caused a massive economic problem. That was known to equate with lives lost. There are decades of economics literature on this topic. I'm not an economist. I work with some of the most famous economists in the world at Stanford. None of them wrote this paper. I was finally called up in the spring of 2020 because I had been writing about the pandemic. I was called up by a University of Chicago economist, John Bird. He said, Scott, you're writing a lot about the pandemic. This lockdown is killing people because of the economic issues alone. We need to write this. Okay, so we quantified it. And after the spring lockdowns of 2020, more than 2 times life years lost was lost from the lockdown than from the virus in the United States. And we were being very conservative in how we were calculating that. That was not a surprise. That was known. The economists were silent. What about the vaccines? This is the data on the vaccines. I'm showing you the charts from the papers on the vaccines. I'm not giving you my opinion. This is Israel data. And what it shows is that the virus reinfection rate, the vaccine is only about 40% effective to stop you from getting COVID, but it's highly effective from getting hospitalization requiring COVID or death. That was what the Israel study showed in July 2021. This is a study from Qatar, October 2021. Effectiveness against any infection drops after about 4 months or 5 months. But effectiveness against severe, critical, or fatal COVID is very high. And it persisted the entire study. That last number there has to be disregarded because those error bars are so large because there's very few cases. So if you just take it for what the significant data is, 90%, 88.9%, that's extremely high for a vaccine. This is Sweden. You notice a pattern here. I'm showing data from other countries. Why? I don't trust the CDC. I don't trust the data. I'm showing you other countries' data. This is October 25th, Sweden. Vaccine effectiveness against symptomatic infection drops significantly after about 4 or 5 months. It's infection. But against hospitalization or death, for the duration of their study, highly effective if you're under 80, that's the red line, and highly effective if you're over 80, except it starts to drop off after about 6 or 7 months. Still pretty effective. What about the issue of COVID vaccine protection versus protection after getting the illness and recovery? This is not a new concept, as my friend Martin Kulldorff often says. This is more than 2,000 years old, this concept. It's not new knowledge. Okay, here's their data. This is August 2021 from Israel. The protection of people who have recovered from COVID is more than 27-fold better against getting symptomatic infection than for people who've had vaccination but never had COVID. The protection against all SARS infection, SARS-2 infection, after having had the infection recovery, is more than 13-fold better than people who've been infected but never had COVID. Been vaccinated but never had COVID. And the protection against hospitalization is more than 8-fold better for people who've had COVID and recovered than for people who've just been vaccinated. That's their data. That's not my data. And recovered people versus recovered but then vaccinated. Is there a difference? This is their data. No difference against protection against symptomatic infection. No difference protecting against all infection. So their data, I'm showing you, shows there is no benefit to getting the vaccine after having had COVID. That's what their data says. It's not an opinion. This is the data on Omicron. variants from Denmark. This is two different vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. Time since vaccine, after 2 months post-vaccine, the efficacy against infection is 4 to 9%. No vaccine would be approved if that's how poor it is performed. That's essentially zero after 60 days. This is the data in New York. Again, I'm showing you their charts. Omicron in kids, 5 to 11 years old, 12 to 17 years old, zero protection after 30 days. 30 days. If you understand that if you get a vaccine, it takes 2 weeks to build up your antibodies from the shot, right? So if there's no protection after 30 days, are you postulating that you need to get an injection every 2 weeks for the rest of your life, or every 10 days? Because there's no protection after 30 days. In this study, here's the facts on the COVID vaccine so far. The facts show the vaccine do not protect as well as or as long as natural immunity of recovered patients against infection, symptomatic infection, or severe infection. That's a fact. The vaccines protect fairly well against COVID death and severe disease, although most of the data is what's called observational studies. The protection against infection of the vaccines is very low after only 4 to 6 months and nearly zero against Omicron after 1 to 2 months. The vaccines, therefore, cannot generate herd immunity or protect society. It is not a public good to get other people vaccinated with these vaccines. It is a private good. It stops you from dying if you are a person who has a risk to die. But it does not protect you from getting the virus infection and spreading the virus infection. Therefore, there is no fear that should be in you if other people are not vaccinated. There are serious safety concerns about things like myocarditis in young males. 1 in 3,000 to 8,000 young males get myocarditis. Myocarditis is a heart inflammation. That's very dangerous. There are other unanswered questions. You have to realize there have been close to 1 billion doses of these vaccines, and we still don't have the data on safety very clearly listed. Why? I want to talk about COVID vaccines in children specifically. It is very important as an indicator of the world and the country we live in. The United Kingdom. This is the committee talking to the NHS, their health system, on vaccination in teenagers. The margin of benefit is considered too small to support advising a universal program of vaccine of otherwise healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. Finland, people under 16 who are not in a high-risk group will not be vaccinated in Finland for the time being, June 2021. Norway, for children who are offered the vaccine, but have not yet reached 16, which is the age of consent in Norway. Parents must consent, and in the case of joint parental responsibility, both must consent because vaccination is voluntary. Denmark, from July 1, 2022, will no longer be possible for children and young people under 18 to get the vaccine. How did the American media react to that? When people said, oh look, they're forbidding the vaccine in some of these countries. AP claimed Denmark has banned COVID vaccines. AP assessment, false. Why did they say that was false on their so-called fact checking? Because they said, well, if you're still at high risk, you can get the vaccine. To the court, that's not what the recommendation said. No one said that. What about the U.S.? This is Eric Rubin, editor-in-chief, New England Journal of Medicine, on the advisory committee for vaccine approval in children, who said, quote, we're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes. I never thought I would live in a country And that was said. This is the clinical trial going on in the United States. This is the NIH website. In healthy children and young adults. Remember, I showed you the risk for healthy children for COVID, right? This is a disease that there is not significant risk of death or severe disease in children. That's a fact. Not only are they studying healthy children, they're studying babies less than 6 months of age with an experimental vaccine. This is their first report, New England Journal, January 2022. They said the vaccine is very good in children 5 to 11 years old. Why? Because they couldn't base it on severe disease or illness. Nobody got a severe disease or illness. They based it on the antibody level in the blood. They said, yeah, this is a good thing. That's not a clinical trial. These are researchers, by the way, from places Duke, Hopkins, Stanford. To me, I think you have to question, is this a complete breakdown of medical ethics here? To inject babies and children with an experimental drug under emergency use authorization that these subjects have no significant risk for severe disease or illness. Of course, the CEO of Moderna filed for authorization of the vaccine in young children. This is April 28, 2022. Emergency use authorization was filed for. There is no public health emergency in spring of 2022, especially for children, but they're getting an emergency use authorization. U.S. public health ethics have disappeared. Why do I say that? This quote, if a school is implementing a testing strategy, this is before vaccine, testing should be offered on a voluntary basis, unethical and illegal to test someone who does not want to be tested, including students. That was written by the CDC in October of 2020. That has since been removed from the website. You can't find it. Why did the public believe the lockdown? This is very important because it's amazing. Well, we have a culture of trust in this country. We trust people with credentials. We're taught to trust people with credentials. There was a lot of fear, both of COVID, but also of the cancel culture when you speak up. And media and politics were used as weapons to demonize those with opposing views. The public believed two lies. Number one, if you're saying you're against lockdowns, you are choosing the economy over lives. That was said. I'm sure everybody here heard that. That's not true. I just showed you that when there's an economic downturn, people die. That was known. It was lives versus lives. It had nothing to do with economy versus lives. And the second lie was if you're against lockdowns, somehow you are for allowing the infection to spread without mitigation, the so-called herd immunity strategy. It has been attributed to me many, many times. I never once said that to the president, said it to anybody in the White House, or even heard anyone else talk like this. That was never said, but it was reported by reporters as having been said and pushed. That is called propaganda. And it's very effective. Why is it so effective? Because of the social media. This is the era of social media, obviously. And this is the only pandemic we've ever had in social media. And social media went crazy with this stuff. Regular media went crazy, though, too. And American media was uniquely poisonous. Why do I say that? This is a study from the National Bureau of Economic Research quantifying what stories were negative versus positive about the pandemic during 2020. The United States media, 91% negative. English-speaking outside the U.S., 54% negative. It's the same pandemic. Same thing with the schools. In the 2020 reporting, the United States stories of increasing cases outnumbered the stories of decreasing cases by a factor of 5.5, even when the cases were declining. America's media also censored information. They didn't just distort information, they literally, overtly censored information and bragged about it. YouTube went to the news, and this was reported as positive. I was censored, among many other people, but I'm saying this, there's some perspective here. You would think that the person who's the president's advisor on the pandemic, maybe people would want to hear what he's telling the president. They pulled it down. September 11th, YouTube pulled down my interview about COVID, but my interview was done in June. I didn't go to the White House in June. They left it up, and when it became evident that I was in the White House, they pulled it down and said it's this information. It was the same information 4 months earlier. October 18th, Twitter deleted my post, quoting verbatim the CDC, the World Health Organization, the University of Oxford, and data on masks. They pulled it down and suspended it. March 19, 2021, after I left, months after, I was called by Governor DeSantis in Florida and asked if I could arrange a press conference with me and 3 others, Kuldorff, Bhattacharya, Gupta, and me. We had a panel discussion for the press, live. That was pulled down as disinformation by the Governor of Florida, people from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard. By November 2020, Facebook told the Washington Post, brag, they had taken down 7 million posts on it. Some news organizations noticed this. The Wall Street Journal, September 2020, said the public can be forgiven for wondering if Dr. Epps' appointment as the White House coronavirus advisor last month has made him a political target. A group of Stanford faculty published an open letter sliming their former colleague last week, and the video came down 2 days later. The Federalist wrote, his opinions have become of greater interest due to his appointment in August as a presidential advisor. That fact alone ought to make it vital the public should be able to hear his opinions. This is obvious. This is not supposed to be communist China. There is a sinful legacy of media propaganda. Sinful. This is fear of health, death. Fear of death from COVID versus actual mortality by age. This is showing that people in the younger age groups, 18 to 24, 25 to 34, have enormously distorted fear of COVID compared to their risk of death, which can barely see it's ingrained, compared to people who are over 65, which are basically correct in assessing their death risk. This is 18 to 24-year-olds, college-age students. 50% of them said they felt nervous about all social interaction. Okay, we have a damaged younger generation. I have 2 kids of my own in their 20s. This matters. It should matter to everybody in this country. During the lockdown, many people gained weight. However, people 18 to 24, 52% of them gained weight, and the average weight gain is 28 pounds. That's obesity. We have created, by the lockdowns, a public health crisis in young people. The real problem is, quote, vested academic interests, it was said in the era of Galileo. This is a huge problem that must be corrected. The scientific journals are blocking the scientific process. This is an article, a letter, written in February 2020 by some of the most famous virologists in the world. And what did they write in February of 2020? We stand together and strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. This isn't even known today. They couldn't have known this when it came out of an actual setting in February 2020. This was written to intimidate the views that said maybe this came out of a lab. There's no place in that for science. That's opposite of the scientific process. Universities censor people now. You know it in this campus. This is my campus, Stanford University. This is 3 medical scientists at Stanford. Johnny Anese, myself, and Jay Bhattacharya. Working independently, we all said the exact same thing about who's at risk, the risk to children, the protective effect of having recovered from COVID, that masks are not going to block the infection. It was proven that schools should open, that lockdowns should not be done, and that focused protection or targeted protection was the way to proceed. We all said the identical thing over and over again. In fact, I was talking to these two almost every single day while I was in Washington. Yet only one of us was issued a censure from Stanford faculty. I wonder why. Here's why. California voted 2-1 Biden over Trump. Stanford has its own zip code where everybody who lives there is faculty, including myself. 95% Biden, 3% Trump. The National Review wrote, Atlas has been singled out for professional erasure because he had the temerity to join President Trump's coronavirus task force and advocate rational measures for safely reopening. Any young people here, if you're asked by the President of the United States to help your country, I hope you say yes. Public health is politicized. This is a huge problem. This is the parents supporting opening K-12 schools by political party. There shouldn't be that kind of disparity in political party. There's something wrong, not with the people, but with the public health leadership and the media. That's what I draw from that disparity. Science is now politicized. Share of Americans who say they have a great deal of confidence in the scientific community by party. It was always about the same. And then, during this pandemic, there's a massive difference by party. Okay, there's something wrong, right? This is not about the people answering the survey. Another problem is public health is led by woefully inept bureaucrats. I saw it. You'd be shocked. I came into the task force with 24 scientific papers in my hand. I was asked by the Vice President, what do you think about the risk of children? I would recite the data. These people, Birx, Redfield, Fauci, they had zero scientific refutation of anything I said. They never had a single paper in the room. Never, not once. They had one thing to say. You are not lying. And it wasn't just that administration. This is Rochelle Walensky, head of the CDC, quoted March 19th. Right now, I'm scared. Okay, that alone is a disqualifier for being in a leadership position. You don't go on TV during a pandemic and tell the country, as the head of the CDC, you're scared. Okay, that's just unacceptable. Turns out, this is when she said that. This is the cases. America's leaders failed. Where were the scientists? Where were the economists? Where were the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the pediatricians? The teachers, the university presidents, the bioethicists, the constitutional lawyers, and independent critical thinking Americans. The protests about these lockdowns were going on in the UK, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, not the United States. Something wrong here. I'll finish up on something more positive, which is that trust in science and public health must be restored, and it can. How? Well, first of all, we have to reinstate ethics in public health. These were violated. We have to demand accountability, including admission of errors in public forums. Anyone who's married knows how good it is to admit you're wrong when you're wrong. We have to define what is a public health emergency. This is the tool that's been used to do this interminable and potentially, again and again, draconian measure. We have to reset the role of health agencies. They were never meant to set rules. They were meant to be advisory. We elect people to make policy. There was a total abrogation of leadership to let the federal policy be run by unelected people named Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci. We have to decentralize research funding and eliminate the control of science, and we have to introduce transparency requirements with penalties on government agencies, government employees, science journals, universities, and training programs. But more than anything else, we have to look in the mirror, because individuals must rise up. And I say those words for a reason. Rise up means speak up like you're expected to in a democracy, in a free society. Martin Kulldorff at Harvard wrote in after that rebuke of me at Stanford and said, quote, "I would be delighted to debate if Scott Adams was right with any of the 98 signatories." It should be no surprise that 0 took him up on that debate. But that's leadership, if he did that. Nobody at Stanford did that. Institution leaders must rise up and lead. You don't have that job to get a salary and walk around with an entourage or a fancy office. We need people who know how to lead to be in leadership positions. This is Sweden. Not only is the government freaking out because their academics are being attacked on social media for publishing their research that's contrary to the narrative, but even Minister for Higher Education and Research, it's deeply concerning. This is in Sweden. When academics are threatened to the extent they don't have the courage to even do their job. President of Karolinska Institute, which is a world-famous medical center in Sweden. A tough debate and diversity of opinions based on facts and evidence are necessary elements of science and public discourse, but hateful and scornful accusations and personal attacks cannot be tolerated. He says, universities have a responsibility to urge researchers to keep a decent tone in debates and discussions. This is missing in the United States. We have to bring in experts from outside government. This is one of the first things I did. I wanted to bring in people who were doing the research to answer the president's questions. If you think the president's incompetent, you better try to help him. Yet I tried to get outside people in there for weeks, and it was blocked internally. And I finally said, okay, this is unacceptable. I went crazy. And they let me bring in Joe Ladapo from UCLA, Cody Meissner from Tufts, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard, Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, to answer the president's questions. Why wouldn't you want that? Because Dr. Birx said, I'm not coming to the meeting. And there was a concern, quote, the election's coming up, don't rock the boat, Scott. No, people were dying. Decentralize the funding. This is what I said before. Why do I say that? This is the list of top funding per year from the NIH alone. Okay? There are more than a dozen universities that get more than $500 million a year from the NIH alone. Do you think that an assistant professor at these places is going to start speaking out against what Fauci says? Not only that, but you can't get a promotion in a university science department without an NIH grant. You just can't. You can't get yourself published in their journal. The same people that control the grants are controlling the journal publications. There is a cartel controlling research. Anyone in a science department here knows we all have adjusted our research so that we can get the funding that they're saying this will be funded if you do research on this topic. So there's a tremendous amount of control of science. This is not good for the public. I have co-founded a new institute with Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya under the guidance of President Larry Arnott Hillsdale. called the Academy for Science and Freedom because science is broken. We need to fix it. If we don't have objective science, if we don't have a depoliticized science, I don't know where we are as a society. We rewrote the ethical principles of public health. We didn't invent them, they existed, but we rewrote them. And they include these, because these were broken. Public health advice should consider the impact on health, not just a single disease, and must consider the benefits and the harms. Public health is about everyone. It should never shift the burden of disease from the affluent to the less affluent. Public health should be adapted to the needs of populations within cultural, religious, geographic, and other contexts. There's no one-size-fits-all. Public health is about comparing risk evaluations. You can never entirely eliminate risk, almost never. Public health requires trust. Public health recommendations should present facts as guidance and never employ fear or shame to sway or manipulate the public. And the number 10 thing here is that it is critical for public health scientists and practitioners to always listen to the public because they are living the public health consequences of public health decisions. Okay, this is a slide I showed in Milan when I was asked to talk about COVID. And I showed it in Milan because it's an illustration from the main paper in Italy that it took 359 years for the church to admit that Galileo was right and the earth moved. I'm betting it's going to take more than 359 years for these people that were locked on it to admit that they were wrong. Lastly, Churchill said, truth is incontrovertible, panic may resent it, ignorance may deride it, malice may distort it, but there it is. And that is the science.
Anybody want to ask questions, please raise your hand.
Who is guiding Birx?
Who is guiding Birx?
Yeah.
So, Birx was appointed on February 29, 2020. February 29. I couldn't figure out who appointed Birx. Everyone denied it. And Birx, I don't know the answer to your question. Birx was a bureaucrat for 30 years, mainly running one of the organizations that helped with AIDS in Africa, etc. But AIDS and HIV transmission is absolutely nothing like this virus. And by the way, bureaucrats are not scientists. And that was proven. Birx is a bureaucrat for 30 years. Fauci is a bureaucrat for 38 years. So I don't know the answer to your question, but that's sort of a random statement.
Hi, Dr. Adams. Thank you. I have a question. So we know that the spike protein on the original strain has changed. And by the time it got to Omicron, there were many, many mutations, rendering it much less dangerous. So my question is, with this messenger RNA sequence that's in the vaccine that was used in the FDA trials and the approval for very young children, were there any tweaks in the RNA strand to make it identical to the Omicron or the current variety of the virus that's circulating, or was it still the original alpha strain?
Yeah, I mean, there's a new vaccine. Okay, it is specifically targeted to these Omicron variants. I don't know the details of how it was created. I don't know the answer to that, except it is specific to this variant. You have to realize more, I think very importantly, the way pandemics end is that viruses mutate to contagious but less lethal strains. That's expected, that's normal. It's not, oh my God, there's a new strain. No. Yes, there's a new strain, it's less lethal, and eventually the virus, which will never disappear, becomes what's called endemic, with cases and a variety of things, but not a lot of deaths. So that's expected that variants occur like Omicron, etc. The question is vaccination against a disease, against a virus that is not very lethal, which, by the way, 80% of Americans have got COVID. 80% roughly. So you have to wonder what the impact of the vaccine is when people have already had recovery from the virus, 80% of people. 97, 98, 99% of people who are high risk have been vaccinated. So, I mean, all these things add up into your decision whether you want to get a vaccine. In my view, it should be your decision. It's supposed to be a free market.
Thank you, Dr. Atlas. With regards to rebuilding trust in the healthcare system, what advice would you have for young people, for individuals who are considering pursuing a career in medicine?
In medicine, yeah. Yeah, it's complicated. First of all, I think there are a couple of things I would just say that are sort of in a disorganized way. First of all, there's a lot more people that agree with you, if you agree with this, than you think. It's just that people are afraid to speak up. And particularly young people. They're very afraid. Your peer group is more important. People like me can say, hey, okay, I'm out of here. But young people don't do that. So, but you have to, I think you have to, in general, and then I'll answer about medicine. You have to have confidence in what you believe. You should do activities and figure out that there are other people that have commonality with you. There's a lot of courageous young people in student journalism and things. You may have read op-ed pieces written in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere by students from the University of Chicago, from Harvard, and a variety of other people. So the more you, if you want, you can find people that are actually sort of helpful in that when someone stands up and takes some heat, it facilitates other people to stand up. Okay? I mean, some people have said that one of the things I did was they said, okay, you were destroyed, and now we can speak up and maybe not be as destroyed. The other thing is in medicine specifically, I think it's very dangerous what's happening in medicine. Okay, there's a lot of stuff going on in medical school curriculum. And I just think we need to maintain logic, common sense in everything we do. But in medicine, there's nothing more important to being a good doctor than understanding logic. They don't teach logic, unfortunately, in medical school. So people, I would say, keep going with going into medicine if that's what you want to do, because we need good doctors. But we need courageous doctors, too. And you know, you have to be able to find some way to stand up for what's right. Okay, there's no alternative than doing the right thing. None. And if you realize that, that's the most important thing.
Thank you, Dr. Atlas, for your information. Forgive me if I missed it. All this information, really great. What exactly do you want us to do with the information here?
I can't hear you. Can you say that?
Oh, yes. The information all is very informative. I very much appreciate it. What exactly do you want us to do with this information?
What do I want you to do with it?
Yes.
Okay, the first thing to do is people like me that are in public policy, the most important thing is educating people, okay, about the reality, facts. It's so common when I go, people say they've never heard the stage before. I mean, the stage has been around. So, A, listen. B, think. Okay, you should question everything. Question me, too, that's fine. Okay, I was raised in a household where I was told basically question authority. There's a healthy degree of skepticism you have to have. I don't think people in this country and on campuses are having that skepticism about what they're told. I think that's very bad. So I think that's something. If nothing else, hopefully I've said something you didn't know or hear. I think you should say, okay, well, I'm going to look that up, or what is that? Because it's not actually what I'm told on campuses. Maybe you're told all this stuff on this campus. Okay, that's not what they're talking about at Stanford, I can tell you that. And so I think that's very important. Know the information, realize that everything is like that. You have to know what you're talking about before you form your opinion. You don't just accept what people tell you. And then the other thing is, if you care about this stuff, I think you should get involved. And what does that mean? That means, be involved in trying to get the word out on what's true and what's false. Okay, I'm sure that many people in their own families have a lot of arguments about this kind of stuff. This is very important. You have to speak up. You can't be afraid. And so, these are just basic ways to function when there's panic in society. Now, right now, okay, we're supposedly out of the pandemic, according to many people. I don't think everybody thinks that. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I think there's a lot of stuff being said and done pre-election. I don't know what will happen after election. I think a lot of people are politicized. And so we'll see. But you have to decide, how to proceed and what you're going to do. I mean, my goal is I'm an educator. Okay, my job is I research and formulate healthcare policy. I've been doing that for full time for 11 years. Before that, I had a 25-year history in medical science and did clinical research and clinical medical practice. So my job now is to be an educator, and particularly I feel it's very important to educate young people and tell them the truth because they have not heard it. So you may have nothing to do after this. I don't know. It's up to you. But if nothing else, you should think. Okay, if you don't hear things you disagree with on a college campus, then you can't possibly learn critical thinking. Okay, and critical thinking is the most important thing you learn in college. Everything else can be learned from a book. You're supposed to hear different things, and by role models, your professors, you're supposed to be sort of pushed to think critically. That's what you're supposed to learn. So when you hear things that you didn't know or you disagree with or you're different, contrary to what you used to be told, that's an opportunity to think critically and reason. That's what I want to do. Yes.
You mentioned early on about teenage boys, myocarditis, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but heart issues. And it's more and more seeping out with saying things that it is a negative, could be a negative effect.
This is from the vaccine. This is one of the side effects of the vaccine.
Yes.
Oh.
But you indicate that there isn't any real data for that in the United States. What about other countries?
Yeah.
Have they studied it?
There is data on that, and it's estimated to be 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 8,000 young men. What I mentioned about not enough data is that there's been a failure, a lack of transparency, a lack of compilation, a lack of tabulation of what's happened to the side effects of the vaccines. Why? I don't know. There's been almost 1 billion doses of these vaccines given. You ought to have very good data on safety. And there's a lot of individual reports, there's anecdotal reports. I'm not sure what's going on with this. I'm not saying that the vaccines are not to be taken. I'm not saying that. I think the vaccines are to be taken if you have a high risk. But I'm not anybody's doctor. I'm not recommending your vaccine. But I think that we should know by now in a very detailed and precise way about the secondary effects of these vaccines. And we don't. And I just wonder why. I think we should try to think, why is that? I don't know why.
Another question that I just wanted to support from my side of the view. I'm from Communist China, which is happening out there doctor that warned my government about the COVID cases in Wuhan were all arrested initially. That's just how terrible, like Mr. Dallas was saying, that you want to speak up against what the public is telling you or is trying to lead you. And even right now in my city, in China, a city called Hangzhou, we have more than 10 million people, and every single person has to get tested every 3 days for PCR test. And you get an app, WeChat, it's like the massive Facebook equivalent. You get a QR code that every time you go to anything inside, you have to show them the QR code so that they know you're tested within 3 days and you're negative. And ironically, like your code from one city does not really work if you're in another city in China. That's ridiculous. And they offer you, like all of the people, free tests, and we all know money comes from somewhere. It's such an easy thing to make people to believe you when you're giving them money, when you're offering more public welfare, so that the good people is not believe you because most people are not doing so well during the pandemic. And yeah, I'm just glad that we're actually having this conversation in the United States, because in my country it's really hard to speak up, and when you do, you end up somewhere. Thank you.
I have a question for you. You had mentioned a number of different, you didn't trust the CDC, so you looked to other countries for data, and I don't trust the CDC either. But at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember it really hard to find information I could trust. Because if you want to stand up and say something like right, you do that. So how do you evaluate information? Maybe it'd be good to go back and look, what could we have done at the beginning that you know? Because we're experts on both sides saying contradictory things. And you can see why it's politicized. But how would we, not being you, evaluate that information?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the very difficult things that happened during this. Who do you believe? Because there were people saying all kinds of things, and of course the natural tendency that we all have is to trust people with credentials. So one of the things that I think we've learned from this is, and along the way we saw this, I think you generally should trust people who are showing you the data, not just talking and wringing their hands and saying, well we're not sure if the word's not out yet on children and the rest. But when you have someone else reciting all the studies, that's very different. You have people who are inconsistent. You have somebody saying, okay, in an email that they wrote at the beginning, the mask couldn't work because the pore size of a mask is bigger than the size of the virus. And then, we better use masks. We better use goggles, or we better use 3 masks. Maybe we should use masks forever. We'll never be able to shake hands again. This is like all over the place. That kind of person is not to be trusted. They've declared themselves as being inconsistent, as not having facts. You may notice some of the most famous people that talk about this on TV, they never talk about the data. Ever. They never have data. I think that's something we need to look at. I mean, it's very difficult. It's a challenge. Nobody has the time to go through this unless that's your job. And the media is not giving you the information on top of things, as I illustrated. So first and foremost, we need to insist on having the media be open. We really need to insist that. Believe me that I think that it's true. People have power. Okay, we have to hold our politicians accountable for making sure the media is objective and open. But along the way, I think it's very difficult, and I think right now there's a lot of damage to the trust. We need to, unfortunately, or whatever, take it upon ourselves to learn more about the information. Now, you have to rely more on yourself. That's what my opinion is. About making responsible decisions for yourselves and your families, your children. The era of trusting people blindly just based on credentials is over. So along the way, it's very difficult. I think it was hard. Although I have to say that everybody who knew anything about medical science knew in 10 minutes that the World Health Organization was wrong on their first estimate. 10 minutes. And you know, it's difficult to say how to reverse it, but there's fear. Once fear is in play, people start to think irrationally. This is what fear does. And so that's understandable. But at some point, you have to get a grip and look at the data. The data's been out there, and I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about even 2 years ago. By the way, why is it that no one notices that Florida has been living normally for more than 2 years? Normally. And if I had time, I would show you the data. Florida did better than California, one of the most draconian policies, and the same sort of geography and heterogeneity and weather and all this kind of stuff. Florida did better than 60% of the country. The onus is not on Florida, by the way, to do better. They didn't have the collateral damage of the lockdowns. The onus is on, the burden is on the states that locked down to show they did significantly better because they destroyed people with the lockdowns, but they better have therefore saved a lot of lives from COVID, and they did. So we need to look at data. We need to be critical thinkers ourselves about stuff we never cared about. But we see what happens when we don't. We can't rely on these people anymore. That's my opinion.
Well, thank you very much for your talk and the information. A couple of observations. I'm a family physician in this community for the last 31 years. And during this whole time, I think I've always been generally a very pro-vaccination person. But they were fine as long as we could offer vaccines to patients. But when all of a sudden they were mandated, I found that extremely disturbing to have the government mandating an experimental something. And especially for the people that work in nursing homes, and I currently see patients in 3 nursing homes, that staff still has to be vaccinated. And you can't work there if you're not vaccinated. If you're not up to date on vaccines, you have to be PCR tested twice every week. And be off work if you're positive on PCR. And meanwhile, they can't find staff for the nursing homes. Our largest home is in Hancock, and it used to be 197 patients, and they're now down to 125. And they have the beds, they have no staff. And, and then a lot of these elderly people without much time on the planet couldn't see their family for, basically in Michigan, more than 15 months. Which was very disturbing. A lot of those people died not being able to see their family.
Yeah, and you bring up something, and there's so many tragedies in that whole story. But there's something that's very important, I think. No one did more to undermine trust in vaccines than the government who wanted to push the vaccines. Because the way to persuade people is giving them the data. That, to me, is the way to win an argument. That's the way you make your point. Not to say, get the vaccine or you're fired. And just a lot of these things that were done totally, in my opinion, undermined the trust in the vaccine. They made people who normally trusted vaccines start saying, wait a second, what's going on? And I think we all saw that. So there's a lot of damage that was done by them, by the people who were trying to force people. And, we can't have that kind of, those people in charge. I'm not saying there's an easy solution to any of this stuff. I'm just saying that, one of the things that to answer the young man's question is, I'm trying to say something to young people, which is that it's very important to be involved. You can't be afraid of being involved. Okay, you're not going to be called up by the President of the United States every day asking to help, but you have to sort of go forward, have some guts, and stand up for what's right. Because when you don't, and particularly if good people don't agree to work in government positions at some level, who's left? Okay, the motivation for people to work in government is, for a lot of the people, is terrible. Okay, there are other people who go who are very want to do good things for the country, and that's the kind of people we need. And we can't have just the people who want it for some other agenda. And that means that more of us have to step up and say, okay, I'm willing to try to help. I think that's a very important message for young people.
Have you thought about running for Congress?
No, as you can imagine, and I have a lot of stories to tell, which some of which are in the book, but, I think Washington is a poisonous place. After having just said, you have to step up and help. It's tough. I don't envision myself doing that at all, no. Partly because, it's a tremendous stress on your family. And I could go into all kinds of stories about how I had to have the FBI involved and police in my driveway 24/7. They had the entrance of my street after I came home over Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's. And, my kids, the whole thing was just, so it's very difficult. So that's a sort of long-winded way of saying absolutely not. Yes.
First of all, thanks for coming up here, but do you think Washington, the bureaucrats, and that whole, do you think they're pretty much all bought off by Big Pharma at this point? And the reason why I'm asking is, throughout this whole pandemic, obviously we all want strong immune systems to have an immune response when the time comes. There's never any thought about cutting off your sugar, cutting on your junk, eating healthy. Never is talked about.
Yeah.
To me, that's just so suspect.
Well,
Why is
there's
that?
two-part answers to that. Yeah, sometimes the obvious things they never get said. One is, there was never any advice to lose weight. That's the number one risk factor for COVID. This is insane. Public health is supposed to be about health. So to your point, there's a lot of corruption. I feel that, yes, there is a lot of pharma corruption. There's no doubt about that. That's been documented by a lot of people. But I think it's a lot worse than that because there's fundamental there's a moral bankruptcy. There's an ethical breakdown. There are people that are corrupt, but not just by money. Money's an easy explanation, but I think they get a lot of other things out of it. There are people that are narcissistic, they're addicted to the power, to the limelight. There are people that are intentionally arranging their own media interviews because they want to be on. And it's a very strange environment there. You can imagine, what it is. So there's a lot of corruption. Only part of it is the money issue. And there are ways to break up some of the corruption, I think, by decentralizing the money, by requiring a far more detailed conflict of interest disclosure than there is. And I think some of these things will probably be done, but some of these things are legislative. There's some accountability that's been missing, even though they're getting a massive amount of taxpayer money and no accountability. So the answer is there's corruption, but it's more than just farm money. Yeah.
Before next question, just a reminder to students from Turning Point USA and Young Americans for Freedom that we need to stay to the end of this meeting and take group picture.
With regards to human ethics, so really disheartening to see the amount of people that are put in positions to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects or participants in clinical trials, and how quickly they fell in line with the rhetoric of saying nobody has that right anymore, and you just have to go with the flow, and you have to have the vaccine, do all these things.
so the question is how do you fix that sort of ethical behavior and the pressure of all of it? And I think here, the problem is that it's complicated. And there is a complicity here in the United States particularly of the media, the university, academia, and the government. And because there's this sort of, they feed on each other. So yes, and we have to work on these things sort of incrementally. There's no magic thing to it, but I am shocked. You know, every clinical trial at a university there's an institutional review board, an IRB, and there's a human subjects committee, and there's ethicists supposedly on there. And some of these things being done, I'm just shocked. So we need to expose it. That's the first step. Like all of this, is really making the public aware. I don't think most people are aware that university medical centers get $500 million to $2 billion a year from the NIH, and therefore they're reluctant to speak out. For instance, so I think part one is just getting the facts out there. You know, part two is having some specific suggestions, which we are working on in a variety of things that I'm doing, and other people are doing this too. I'm not claiming that I'm doing this alone. So it's a process, but I think that the more people are aware, the more they bring it up. They bring it up to their representatives. You know, the federal government is controlling these agencies, the NIH. I mean, why is it that they didn't do clinical trials in the spring of 2020 on already FDA-approved drugs that were cheap? We should have known in the spring of 2020 that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and others didn't work. They should have known immediately. If they don't work, they should have known it. They should have done the clinical trial. These were FDA-approved drugs already. They're safe drugs. Yet, they were vilified as being dangerous, and they were just never really studied. There's a trial going on now on ivermectin. It'll be done in another year or something, 2024. Okay. I mean, so, some of those drugs are so safe they're not even prescription drugs in other countries, by the way, over the counter. So the whole message that they were dangerous is absurd. But people didn't stand up. And then the question is why? Is it a pharma problem with corruption and they want to get expensive drugs? I don't know, but it's at least totally communist. We need to, and that's an ethical issue. And so we need to get that exposed, sunlight, to these problems. And we need to propose solutions. And we need to elect good people into government who are going to understand that they need to clean house at these agencies, completely clean house. I mean, there's absolutely no reason to me that somebody can have a 30-year career in a health agency in the government. That's not good. The way you stay in a position in these health agencies in the federal government is not because you're so politically neutral. It's because you know how to navigate very skillfully the most politicized environment you can imagine. And they go and they get friends in the other agencies, they get friends. They were referring to the people in the media by their first names. I'm going to go and have a discussion with Sanjay, they would say. Sanjay Gupta. I didn't know anybody by their first name. You know, I mean, so, you know, we can't have those kind of people. I mean, that's really, and so how do you get rid of them? You have to elect good people who understand that those are the people who are the problem. I mean, it's a process. And I don't have a simple answer.
Thank you for coming up here. Really appreciate it. I'm wondering if, obviously, you're more of a conservative bent, but I'm wondering if you've read the famous liberal Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and if you could comment on that.
Well, I'm not sure I'm more of a conservative. I don't know about my political characterization. I can tell you this, all the public record stuff, you'll never see a newspaper write about what my voting is, even though it's public record, because it doesn't fit there. Point number one, that's an aside. Robert Kennedy's book, okay, I didn't read the book. I've spoken around her family a couple times about it. I have no reason to doubt the veracity of his claims about Fauci. It's a very well documented book, and it's an interesting array of things that have happened. There's a track record there that's 38 years long. And he seems to have done a good job of going through that in detail.
We need to conclude right now because students need to go and finish assignments which I gave them for tonight.
Eric, can I make one comment? One comment to the individual that asked, how do I know what to trust? I may have spoke up early on in this thing a little bit. I can tell you one thing I looked at is how come the homeless population in the United States wasn't absolutely decimated by the COVID? That's a little bit of critical thinking that you can apply that doesn't require a lot of education. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay, so let's express our appreciation to Dr. Arthur.